This is On the Line, and I'm Eric Felton. The U.S. plans to wrap up major combat operations in Afghanistan by 2014. President Barack Obama's advisors are working on plans for the majority of NATO troops to leave Afghanistan. But how many will stay behind, and what will their mission be? I'll ask my guests. Brian Bennett, National Security Correspondent for the Los Angeles Times, and Phil Stewart, Pentagon Correspondent for the Reuters News Service. Welcome. Thanks for joining us today. So, Brian, what needs to be decided about the troop levels, and when does it need to be decided by?
So currently there are about 66,000 U.S. troops in Afghanistan, and there's a question of whether or not that same level should stay through the fighting season this coming summer. The rhythm in Afghanistan for the fighting, it tends to escalate as the weather gets warmer and then de-escalate during the winter. So the question is, will the military planners want to keep the same level of U.S. troops through to the fall of 2013, or begin to draw them down at the beginning of next year?
And Phil, the decision about the drawdown then is going to be not only a question of when to start that drawdown, but how far that drawdown is going to go.
That's right. There's really two decisions here. One is how fast do you draw down in 2013 and 2014, and the second is how many troops are you going to keep in Afghanistan after 2014.
So how does that decision get made?
Well, they're going to try and do the 2014 piece of it first, and then they're going to use that as their basis for deciding how fast and where to withdraw the forces to.
Well, Brian, what kind of numbers are they talking about for the troop levels after the major combat operations are done?
So when Obama has promised that he would draw down major combat forces by 2014, and the question is, what size of force do you leave in place, and what kind of role the U.S. will have? The thought right now is that the U.S. would have enough people in place to perform like major advisors for the Afghan police and military in their regional headquarters. NATO would also play a role in that. And also the big question is, for the Afghan military, they don't have the logistics in place to really operate effectively. And so the U.S. and NATO have to work out, okay, how many people do we need in the country to provide logistic support, like medical evacuation for Afghans, just getting basic food and supplies into the field to support Afghans, getting Afghan commandos to the fight using transport planes and things like that. How many people does the U.S. and NATO need to keep in the country in order to sort of support the fighting troops of the Afghans is the big question.
Now, Phil, people have talked about numbers anywhere from 30,000 on the top end to just 1,000 or so on the bottom end, with maybe 10,000 being a number that's knocked around a lot. But you wrote this week, President Barack Obama publicly scoffed at the idea of keeping 10,000 troops in Iraq. So could he really be persuaded to keep that many in Afghanistan? So you posed the question. Did you find the answer?
Well, I think that question is still open. There were two reports this past week talking about the 10,000 number. And looking back to the October 22nd debate, Obama basically mocked his opponent, Mitt Romney, in the election, before the election, for having suggested keeping 10,000 troops in Iraq. So, and he said basically that would have tied us down. So would he feel that we're tied down in Afghanistan by keeping 10,000 troops there? I think the answer is he might, and politically that might be difficult for him to play to his base, saying that he's ended the war.
One thing that Obama has always said about Afghanistan is that this was the real fight. After September 11th, we should have focused on Afghanistan, gone after al-Qaeda, gone after the terrorist cells that are operating out of Pakistan, and that was the place we needed to. So there could be some justification for having a larger force in Afghanistan that's off into the future, maybe a few thousand, that are focused on not just supporting the Afghan military, but counterterrorism strikes, gathering intelligence, and launching what military planners like to call surgical strikes on terrorist cells.
And if I could just interject, I mean, there is a way to do this where it could be more politically feasible, where you say, actually, we're going to keep 8,000 troops, then you have extra 3,000, 4,000 enablers. So you can kind of play with the numbers a little bit, and that might work out better for the politics back home.
Now, Phil, one of the key players in this decision-making process is the general who has been the head of NATO forces in Afghanistan, and yet he's been caught up peripherally in a sex scandal, and this investigation is still going on. How is that affecting the decision-making process?
Well, this is the amazing thing, partly about Washington, partly about the whole situation we're in right now, is that, you know, on Tuesday, Defense Secretary Leon Panetta actually spoke with Allen by video teleconference or video conference from Afghanistan, and the idea is that presenting all of this this scandal as something off in the corner, that General Allen can do his job and be unaffected by this scandal. You know, whether that's really true is something that we'll have to see. Obviously, there must be some impact on the general's ability to communicate with media, to communicate with the public, if he's cloistered away and unable to speak publicly, given all the political ramifications of the investigation.
Brian, what's your sense of how that's affecting this other, you know, much more important issue of figuring out troop levels? I
mean, it seems so far. It seems for General Allen, it's a sideshow. I mean, it's something that the FBI is looking at. We're going to have to see. One thing about when the FBI starts looking at people's emails, they tend to find other things. So we don't know what else could unravel out of this. But at the moment, the White House has said, look, we have the full confidence in General Allen, and they seem to be willing to move forward and work with him on Afghan planning going forward.
And Phil, one of the other major players in all of this, of course, the Afghans and the Afghan government. There had been in Iraq figuring out the final status, what kind of troop levels were going to be in Iraq. That was all going to be worked out with the Iraqis, and then it all kind of fell apart at the last minute, and ultimately no troops were there. Is that a cautionary tale that people are looking at in terms of negotiating with Afghanistan about what these final troop levels will be?
It sure is. I mean, there is an incredible comparison to be made between Iraq and Afghanistan, in the sense that the whole deal fell apart because the U.S. wanted immunity for its troops from local prosecution. They wanted to be able, if they did something wrong, they want to try them back in the United States. And in Afghanistan, that's going to come up again. And whether or not they can reach a status of forces agreement, or a SOFA, is really, you know, the idea is they're going to finish it by May, but they're going to have to really get cracking.
Brian, what's your sense of how hard the Afghans are going to push for wanting to be able to try U.S. or NATO forces in Afghan courts if they're accused of some kind of wrongdoing?
Well, it's a big issue, and not only for U.S. troops, but also for the U.S. contractors that come along with U.S. troops. And that's been something that has been at the forefront that Karzai has been focused on, is trying to make sure that the U.S. security contractors are registering and following protocols that he's trying to put in place to try to rein in the number of Americans that are in the country and keep track of what they're doing and how they operate.
And what about in Afghanistan? I mean, we talk about different political pressures in the U.S. What's the debate in Afghanistan about how much U.S. NATO presence is desired? Phil?
Well, I mean, the debate in Afghanistan is that they're moving into this moment of incredible uncertainty. You know, you're winding down this long war. All the money that drove the war is coming out of this, leaving the country. And then you also have a situation where they're preparing for an April 2014 election that could really add a whole new level of uncertainty to the security situation in the country. So I think that they're very concerned.
And Brian, how concerned are the Afghans about their ability to take over the lead military role? I mean, there's been years and years and years of this idea of standing up the Afghan military, and yet the Afghans don't have a sort of functioning air force and the ability to evacuate people from the battlefield, and that's just the start of the problems they're facing. What's the expectation they're going to be able to solve those problems in time?
And right now, the U.S. trainers and NATO trainers aren't even focused on having a self-sustaining Afghan military. Right now, they're just focused on training the tip of the spear, training commando forces that are actually out performing the duties of a military and an internal security force in Afghanistan. the whole back end of a military and a police force is still an open question, and how that's going to be handled within Afghanistan. And there's sort of a realization coming down that it's not going to be, they aren't going to have all the flashy toys that NATO and the U.S. can provide. For medevacs, for example, getting wounded soldiers off the battlefield, they are probably not going to have a lot of medevac helicopters. They're going to try to build a big fleet of ground transport that can bring people off, wounded Afghans off the battlefield. And the idea is to come up with sort of maybe lower tech solutions to some of the logistics problems that the Afghan military faces.
Well, Brian Bennett of the Los Angeles Times and Phil Stewart of Reuters, thanks so much for joining us today.
Happy to be here.